Well, hey there team, welcome back to the channel and welcome to the overview. Today we're going to be reviewing Hell Is Us. So look, I'm going to try and keep this as concise as I can, but it's probably going to be a bit all over the place. I've attempted recording this a few times and yeah, it's been a bit all over the place. That being because there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of moving parts. This game's very original. It's a melding of many different things. It had a pretty good way of covering the launch in that it had mystique going into it. You know, before I had my hands on it, I didn't really know what I was getting into. And funnily enough, what it is probably very different from what you might be expecting going in. Also, there's some pretty heavy duty themes in here that I think are explored quite well as a backdrop, and 10 out of 10 world building using this sort of ethnic civil war component, but being that every second person with a microphone these days fancies themselves some media literate modern day philosopher, I think a lot of people are going to grab for the low-hanging fruit and see parallels in a lot of the conflicts with, you know, the modern hot button topics that everyone loves talking about, you know, your Ukraine and your Palestine and all that sort of stuff. It's not really what's going on here. Anyway, I know I'm talking very broad, but that's the point. There's so many moving parts going on here, but the important takeaway is I really enjoyed my time with this game. In a much more, let's even say traditional, slower burn, a delay of gratification kind of slow burn. So much so that actually I had a few issues with it going into it in the beginning. I wasn't having the best experience, but the longer I played it, the more I fell in love with it. In many ways, this may well be the cure to what ails you in the modern gaming environment, which is to say analysis paralysis, YouTube and Instagram feeds and reels, just constant dopamine overstimulation states that everyone finds themselves in. By locking out time to play this game and just let it wash over me, it was actually a really good reset, which lines up with how I've been sort of gaming recently, which is to say narrowing my scope to avoid all of that, let's say, excess stimuli. So as far as scoring this game, I've been running an experimental score system this year. Basically, the idea is to review 100 games and rank them from 100 down to 1. It's unconventional, but it serves as a list, and I find it to be more helpful to you, a potential, say, customer consumer, by giving an itemized ranking of what I suggest one after the other, as opposed to, giving 90% of the games that I cover a 7 out of 10, like all the other major publishers that are scared of losing their review key access. So at the time of this review, I'm putting this at 88%, which is to say sitting slightly above Tainted Grail and just below Shinobi Art of Vengeance, which we just covered the other day. So high praise and nestled snugly between two very good games in and of themselves. It's probably worth taking a moment to talk about the pedigree of what's going on here. It's being published by Nacon, who, you know, they are a name on the block, but they're a bit hit and miss, and they're still very much out of the mainstream. This might be one of their more high-profile releases that they've had this year, actually. But as far as the developer, now that's where it's interesting. It's being developed by Rogue Factor, who are known mostly for their two main releases, Mordheim, I think it had a sub-name like Mordheim, City of the Damned, there you go, and then Necromunda, Underhive Wars, right? So Mordheim and Necromunda. Now, if you don't know anything about those games or those settings or any of their background, the quick and dirty is consider Games Workshop, who makes the Warhammer franchise. Warhammer Fantasy is to Warhammer 40k, right? They're very similar games. They have a lot of mechanics the same, but one's fantasy setting and one's future setting. I know I'm dumbing it down a little bit for the veterans, don't get too salty. And Mordheim and Necromunda were kind of sister sub-spin-off, almost indie versions in their own right, where you do these like squad-based tactical warband management things. So it's less about a huge army and more about smaller units. Now, I'm a huge fan of those. I grew up playing them, so I have an immense bias towards them being made as games. However, Rogue Factor was pretty iffy with those releases. Mordheim was always very clunky. It might have been a bit ahead of its time as a game, as an indie game specifically, but it was always a bit of a mess to play. And Necromunda was much better, but they broke the AI so incredibly bad, pretty much on the same scale as like the AI out of Alien Colonial Marines. So their pedigree, as much as I have bias in my heart to what I want their games to be good, weren't that great. This is all to set up and say that they've shook that off. I think they've done much better here. However, there's one big glaring problem that you cannot get away from. It is an Unreal Engine game. And I'm usually someone that's a bit immune to the stutter problem, right? I run pretty high-end rigs, I don't really have a problem with it, and the truth is I might not even necessarily notice it quite as much as some others, being that it's just never really upset me enough to mention it, but it's being mentioned here. This has got to be the most horrible, stuttery mess, performance-wise, of any game I've ever played to date. And I was driving myself mad playing with all different settings, trying to get it to, run properly and stop stuttering. Ultimately, I did something strange that doesn't make any sense. Like I changed the resolution to 1080p under the windowed setting, but then set it back to borderless. And at borderless, it auto forces back to 1440p, which was what I was rendering on. And from then on, that pretty much cured all of the stuttering problems whatsoever. So I have to wonder if there is a layer of contrived broken code that's causing them a huge problem with their engine. I don't know, but I just couldn't find any way to fix it and settled on the fact that they must have poorly optimized texture streaming or something going on like that, because that's a big part of what's exacerbated by the stutters in Unreal. But again, I flicked some magic switch. It certainly had nothing to do with my gear or any actual real proper setting, but something flicked something under the hood and it started working about, 2/3 into my playthrough without a hitch. Probably the biggest red flag against this game, and it's a bit of a tragedy. Anyway, so there's been plenty preamble, plenty of setup, and it's also worth pointing out, if you are sold on the mystique of this, I've already told you that I think it's really good and it's one of the more fun games that I've enjoyed this year. That might be enough for you to just stop the video and go play it, because I reckon the less you know about this game, the more you're going to enjoy it. So let's just get this out of the way. What you think it is probably not what it actually is, if that makes any sense. This is not Death Stranding or anything like that. I know some people got a bit of mouthfeel from that. No, not even remotely close. What this really is, it's kind of a Resident Evil type game, but scaled up. Instead of being sort of set in one small scale, fairly dense mansion, for example, going back and forth and trying to solve rudimentary puzzles and open diamond doors with diamond keys, it takes all of that general broad top-down design and it puts it in essentially an entire little country that's cordoned off from the rest of the world. That might be the biggest hoop to jump through of disbelief, is that they are like essentially isolated, almost, well, not Amish style, because they seem to all have all the tech that we'd have. So it's a bit of a contrivance, but it is to say that it's a bit of a place out of time. And I think that's more just a narrative set up to create a bit more of a closed system and explain why the way people behave here is a little bit more backwards. But my point is, without getting into that point and getting away from the original one, it's Resident Evil, but on a much larger scale. It's lots of different instanced areas that you move between. It's not like you can jump or anything like that. So like there is some very fixed pathing. It does lean into a lot of, you fall down a 5-foot step, you can't go back up that way. There's no map or anything like that. This might drive people a bit mad, and honestly, I get why they're doing it, and the game in turn demands your attention through that and through a lot of the way that it's designed, or the way that puzzles play out and clues are handed out. I could see people actually writing down notes potentially. It's not super hardcore like 90s adventure games, right? But I understand why they've done it. But at the same time, even with the Resident Evil example, a map is always a very helpful, comfortable assist in a Resident Evil game. Then you can see what area you've been to, what you've scrubbed. In those games, they often color code. Green means you've got all the items you can get, that sort of thing. This game would have benefited from something similar to that. It's got every other gameplay design choice from something like a Resident Evil. Why not have the map? And there were times where I kind of didn't know where I was going, and I wasn't 100% sure where I had and hadn't scrubbed, which resulted in quite a bit of time, backtracking and re-scrubbing retrodden areas. It wasn't a huge problem, I'll be honest. This is getting more into quality of life, but I feel like it's a little bit of a misstep not putting in even a rudimentary map to help you tick off where you have and haven't been. So that's the main thing that I would actually say, which you probably didn't take away from any of the trailers or anything like that. Very much a puzzle heavy, the square block goes in the square hole, Resident Evil style gameplay design. And it even has some light Metroidvania to it in that you pick up these sort of keys along the way that can open chests to backtrack, and often the access to a door or a tomb or whatever from a previous area won't open up until you push the story forward in another direction. It is for the most part fairly linear, like it's a soft open world, but you kind of know at any given time what you're supposed to be doing. And in the mid of the game around Act 2, it sends you, on multiple missions to get multiple MacGuffins, right? So you can kind of pick, I'm going to go 1, 2, or 3 and go on from there. I'd also say there's a lot of heavy influence from thematically something like Silent Hill, which is an interesting marrying, right? I know I mentioned Resident Evil, but that was purely mechanical, and I've always held too that the Resident Evil games aren't strictly horror games as a rule. You could in fact take the Resident Evil gameplay mechanics and put them in any other bloody thematic genre, similar to what they've done here, which is arguably a bit more eerier psychological horror, which is more in the domain of a Silent Hill. So there's a lot of misty landscapes limiting your vision. The main enemies that you verse in this do seem more like something you'd see in Silent Hill. It's leaning into, and I want to dance around it and not get into it, but like the themes of grief and terror and, sort of like vices being tied into ability sets of both what you can put on your weapons, but also the enemies that you face. And then you've got the soundtrack as well. It has all these droning, eerie, uncomfortable tracks that are brilliant and beautiful and very mood setting, but that's what I'm sort of getting at. From that mood design, it very much channels something much more like a Silent Hill type game. For the moment-to-moment mechanical combat, because we've talked about the broad play-by-play of puzzling and navigating the environment, it definitely does have a Souls-like thing going on, right? But there are a few caveats. I feel like closer to character action is a fair way to put it. You don't get souls, right? And then once you kill dudes, they're pretty much perma-dead. So you can find yourself in situations where, you'll get killed and then you'll just come back from the checkpoint and then continue on, right? You don't pick up souls, but the dudes don't get back in your way. You don't have to grind them. Leveling's not really a huge problem. Your weapons have an internal leveling system that scales as you go as well. So that's how you get the damage increases, basically just by using the weapons. They'll hit a cap eventually, and through the course of narrative unlocks, you'll be able to blacksmith upgrade the weapons a bit higher to do more damage. There are 4 different weapon types, I believe, like dual axes, sword, great sword, and kind of like a pole arm thing. I got a lot of value out of the great sword. In turn, you can specialize each of these weapons into a specific, like I said, almost like a vice. It's more like a negative emotion, to be honest. I believe it's grief, wrath, ecstasy, and terror. They might be the 4. And in turn, once you choose a specialization, you can slot these kind of skill spells to your weapon and use the bumpers to unlock them as well, right? And so you can end up with some really unusual combinations and interplay. I ended up running a rage greatsword. There you go, rage was one of the emotions. And I managed to equip a glyph spell that uses the mana that's tied to the weapon. And you can use consumables to get more mana, and combat and combos gets more mana. But I could shoot these sort of like red fireballs out of it, and I found them to be really helpful for chipping away at enemies. You have a kind of health mini-game recoup system, so like you'll land a couple of shots on a dude and then you'll have this sort of glowing telegraph around your character or on your health bar, and if you press the right bumper correctly at the right time, you'll recoup that health. So I wouldn't necessarily say it encourages aggressive play, but it creates for an unusual interplay of going in, trying to get a few landing shots on an enemy and trying to cash that in as health, especially when you consider that as your health bar goes down, so does your max stamina, and you might be at a point where you're only 1 or 2 hits, like you're limping along. your dude will also get exhausted very easily. So getting out of that situation without like a health potion, because you don't really have Estus, you just have consumables, becomes another sub strategy of its own. 1-2 shots, recoup health, dodge out. There's a parry system, there's execution systems, that sort of stuff. But like I said, yeah, it's a third-person action game. The enemies do have telegraphs, but you have your own little spells that you lean into. You also have this drone on your back, and he, in turn, has a bunch of slottable character action abilities. The one you're going to use the most is sort of a taunt to keep the enemy busy while you fight one at a time, because a lot of the combat plays out that way. But you get all these other gimmick ones, like sort of swirling barbarian whirlwinds or charges and that. And so there's a lot more tools in your kit for little gimmicky attacks and spells than you might necessarily see in something like a more stat-based game like a Dark Souls. And I mentioned fighting the enemies one at a time. One of the big novelties is you fight these sort of souls, right? And you can only fight them with the limbic weapons. This is a whole thing in the world I don't necessarily want to get into too much, but these monster things are essentially immune to conventional weapons. So you got to fight them with these melee weapons. And quite often what they'll do is they'll spew out this emotion-based entity monster that's tethered to them by like a leash. And while that thing exists, the main pasty white soul that spawned it is invulnerable. So you have to destroy the emotion, and then once you do that, you can in turn attack the original guy that kind of cast it. It's sort of like a pet in a way. And you do get some pretty devious combinations later on where they will spit out multiple of the same or different emotions. And sometimes you'll have multiple of those white dudes summoning into the same leashed entity. And so you can have a fairly large pitched battle, and you have to pick off the entities and then alternate and then take out one of the white ghost dudes, but then they'll spit out another entity because it's on a cooldown, and then you'll have to go back and fight that again. So, while you're looking at this and you're probably thinking all the enemies look the same, there are some variants and all that. They're all got that same pasty white design. The interplay is actually very clever and unusual, and I can't think of anything that I've seen that really does that. And then look, I also mentioned that there's a bit of a Tomb Raider-esque to it. Delving into tombs and digging up the history of this world is a big part of this gameplay as well. And I left that to last because that ties into world building also. So this world, this Haidea that is this fictitious little small country, is essentially cordoned off and sealed away from the rest of the world. In more recent contemporary history, because there's a lot of history in the world that you pick up, and it doesn't spoon feed it to you, but it definitely throws a lot of lore bits at you. So if you're not paying attention, you're not going to get any of it, but there's a very rich experience and a very well-realized world for those paying attention. But in more recent times, they had like a dictator that kind of explains their more closed-borders approach. But also it has thousands of years of history, so it's not really super apparent how they've managed to stay so isolated from the rest of the world. But again, that's just a leap you have to make a little bit with this. A big crux of the modern version of this world, and without going into it too much, there's ancient orders, there's history. Like I said, there's these ruins, buried secrets, where these monster things come from, why'd they suddenly turn up, has it happened before, and again alluding to delving into tombs and that sort of stuff. Like I said, there is a rich history and a background to it, but in the more contemporary setting, the staging is that there has been a civil war, an outpouring of ethnic violence. Peacekeepers from outside world are involved in a UN type organization, and at the core of it, the tale as old as time that glues it all together is that you have two ethnic peoples, and they're much closer to something like the split between the orange and the green in, say, Ireland, right? So Protestant, Catholic, and if you're not aware of that, and I'm not going to try and give you a lecture on churches, but essentially one church, the Protestant sort of movement, is more reformist, right? Didn't necessarily like the rigidity and strictness of the previous founding fundamental church of Catholicism. So they made their own, right? With slightly, let's say, more relaxed rules. Again, this is really broad. I'm keeping it broad because their heads will explode as soon as you start talking about religion. But the same thing's going on here. You have a more traditionalist religious peoples, and you have the more progressive reformists that spun off into their own thing. And all of it's pretty heavy-handed, but the core message, the core point that keeps this whole world tied together is that they're in a perpetual cycle of ethnic violence, right? And you moving around the world, and I won't even necessarily get into it, but you come across an APC, and that's your little personal transport through this civil war. But as you cross north and south of the border, you find examples of people just wiping out entire other peoples because they're the other, Sabinians or whatever they call themselves, and they just hate them and they think they're evil. But you cross the border and it's the exact same thing back to front, right? The game knows exactly what it's doing. It's not picking a side, but it's just sort of meditating pretty heavily on the idea that it doesn't necessarily matter who threw the first stone, because now you have generational ethnic hate across both state lines. And it is explored in every way you could possibly think. You have children talking about how they're taught in schools to hate these people because of their beliefs. And you've got children, again, on that topic that, they've seen mum, dad, the dog all get killed by these people that were laughing and killing them. And so now that kid's going to grow up to hate the other people as well. These are just little examples. And so it is kind of heavy duty topically, but it does a good job in a, like I said, a brutal height of violence kind of way of illustrating that at a certain point, everyone's wrong and everyone's just killing each other and it's horrible. And as you can probably guess, without going into it too much, it's probably these monsters rocking up and killing everyone with emotion-based abilities might have something to do with all of this, but who can really say? Anyway, and in the midst of all, you play as this guy Remy, who is essentially someone who was born in Hadia, but he managed to actually escape as a child. And he's come back for essentially personal reasons. It's fairly primal. I want to know what's going on. I just want to understand. And the Civil War is the perfect tumultuous way for him to slip in between the cracks. And then from there, he follows in to figure out what his father does, and the adventure ensues. And it's actually really well told and weaved in between it all. And I suppose that's something to just be cautious of, right? I feel like so many people that fancy themselves be political big brains are going to get so focused on the ethnic backdrop of the two peoples killing each other for all sorts of reasons that they can come up with. But if anything, all that is just a rich setting for which you get to navigate. It's not really the story, but it is definitely an unusual setting couched in what a lot will perceive as hot button topics. The game's not really here to tell you who's right and who's wrong, other than everyone's probably wrong because they've all been killing each other for generations. But yeah, it makes for a really unusual setting. I mean, good for them for rolling the dice on this. It's going to upset a lot of people, but just because they are pearl clutchers. But I think it's pretty well done, actually, for what is ultimately a pretty heavy-duty topic set. Anyway, yeah, look, I know I've talked broadly and thematically, and I haven't been very specific because the specifics are the fun in there. The game doesn't hold your hand, even though maybe it should, at least for something as little as a map or whatever, and it kind of can't get out of its own way when you are left to your own devices. It has like this investigation system for doing missions, which, it's basically just dot points, writing things down and kind of vague. And yeah, honestly, I found it made me engage with the game more, but it's not going to be for everyone. That's for sure. This might frustrate some people, but it might be a breath of fresh air, especially for some older gamers that miss being, a little less pat on the head with mission guidance. And, it has speckled side stuff through the game, not, generic side missions per se, but someone might have lost something during the course of fleeing in the battles, and you're going to find these nominal items and hand them back to them and just generally do good deeds. So there's stuff there to keep you invested, to keep you busy. It kind of makes me think of something like the Mafia games. We looked at Mafia recently, and I've talked about this many times, how they have a sort of peripheral open world. It's realized to a point and you move through it, but you're never really supposed to poke at it. You're not really supposed to go out into that open world and realize that it's not really super well realized. It's supposed to be for your peripheral vision to make you feel immersed. And much of this world and the side quests and the characters in it do feel that way as well. Remy has his mission. He wants to find out what's happened with his family. He's trying to get his answers. And so he's moving through this world that just so happens to be a war-torn, horrible hellscape with people killing each other for stupid reasons, basically. And you can explore it, and it's very well developed, and there's a lot of info there, but at the end of the day, it's still his story. It just happens to be set in this very unusual and yet wonderfully realized setting. Anyway, that's my review of this game. I really liked it. I think it's great fun in a kind of miserable dire kind of way. I hope people are more informed going in without necessarily spoiling it too much. And I would also encourage people to sniff around. I'm not the biggest tech head when it comes to understanding stutters and engine problems, but like I said, it's probably the worst I've ever seen until I accidentally fixed it somehow. So I'd look into that as well if you're a bit cautious and maybe you got low end gear. Anyway, team, enough of that. Might just leave it there for the time being, and I'll catch you guys on the next one.